Good evening. Welcome to the organizational meeting of the Solon Board of Education. Mr. Buchanan, would you call the roll, please?
Yes. Mrs. Barksdale.
Here.
Mr. Heckman.
Here.
Mrs. Glavin.
Here.
Mrs. Moses.
Here.
Mr. Pat.
Here.
Please stand for the Pledge of Allegiance.
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
This is the time in our annual meeting when we have a number of business items that we go through, and we also have the election of officers for the next year, for this coming year. At this time, I will open the floor for nominations for the position of President of the Board of Education. If anyone has a nomination, please say so.
Like to nominate Mrs. Moses.
Very good. Is there a second?
Second.
Mr. Buchanan, would you call the roll, please? If there's no, is there any discussion? If there are no other nominations, then I will close the nomination. And Mr. Buchanan, would you call the roll?
Mr. Heckman.
Yes.
Mr. Patton.
Yes.
Mrs. Barksdale.
Yes.
Mrs. Glavin.
Yes.
Mrs. Moses.
Yes.
Good.
Thank you. At this time, I will turn the meeting over to the new president. There that goes.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone.
Just like that.
Congratulations. Just like that.
Just like that.
We don't need
Was
multiple
that too
votes.
quickly, or?
It didn't take a
Yeah,
deep
it might
ballot.
take 15.
Yeah, we could have gone for 15 ballots. We're more efficient.
Well, we have the election of the vice president. Maybe we can try for
That's
15
true.
then.
That's true.
Well, thank you, everyone, for the vote of confidence. And I will continue with the meeting with the election of the vice president. At this time, I'll entertain nominations for the position of board vice president. And just as a note, the board vice president is elected to serve a term of 1 year. Anyone nominate?
I'd like to nominate Julie Glavin as vice president.
Julie's been nominated.
I'll second.
Julie, second, has been given by Mrs. Barksdale. Is there any discussion? Are there any other nominations? We'll close nominations. Mr. Buchanan, will you take the roll?
Mr. Patton.
Yes.
Mrs. Barksdale.
Yes.
Mr. Heckman.
Yes.
Mrs. Glavin.
Yes.
Mrs. Moses.
Yes. Congratulations.
All right.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Continuing on with our organizational meeting, resolution to authorize withdrawal of funds. A recommended motion to authorize withdrawal of funds as noted in enclosure 6. Can I have a motion, please?
So moved.
Can I have a second?
Second.
Moved by Mrs. Glavin, seconded by Mr. Heckman.
Yes, this is just an annual item to make certain that we can withdraw funds as needed for district operations.
Any questions? Mr. Buchanan?
Mrs. Glavin.
Yes.
Mr. Heckman.
Yes.
Mrs. Barksdale.
Yes.
Mr. Patton.
Yes.
Mrs. Moses.
Yes. Number 7, meeting dates. Recommended motion to establish the regular meeting dates of the Solon Board of Education at the Solon Board of Education offices at 6 p.m. unless otherwise noted, and those dates and times are listed below. Can I have a motion, please?
So moved.
Second.
Moved by Mrs. Barksdale, second by Mr. Patton. Any discussion? Mr. Buchanan?
Mrs. Glavin.
Yes.
Mr. Patton.
Yes.
Mrs. Barksdale.
Yes.
Mr. Heckman.
Yes.
Mrs. Moses.
Yes. Number 8, legal services. Recommended motion to authorize the resolution to retain the law firms of Squire Patton Boggs, Britton Smith Peters, Khalil, and Markakis Company LPA, Brinza, McIntyre and Seed, and Weston Hurd LLP to perform legal services in connection with matters relating to education, including fundamental matters, as included in enclosure 8. Can I have a motion, please?
So moved.
Second.
Moved by Mr. Heckman, seconded by Mrs. Glavin. Any discussion? Mr. Buchanan?
Mr. Heckman.
Yes.
Mrs. Glavin.
Yes.
Mrs. Barksdale.
Yes.
Mr. Patton.
Yes.
Mrs. Moses.
Yes. Number 9, service fund. Recommended motion to establish a service fund to set aside as an account within the general fund to cover expenses incurred by members of the Board of Education actually incurred in the performance of their duties, not to exceed the amounts authorized by Ohio Revised Code Section 3315.15. Have a motion, please?
So moved. Second.
Moved by Mrs. Glavin, seconded by Mrs. Barksdale. Mr. Buchanan?
Mrs. Glavin.
Yes. I thought we already did that part. I was reading on.
I didn't want to tell you how to.
I was reading it forward.
Jump ahead.
Mrs. Barksdale,
Yes.
Mr. Heckman.
Yes.
Mr. Patton.
Yes.
Mrs. Moses.
Yes.
It's a new year. It's a new
Yeah, it's a
year.
new year.
He's not used to being.
Yeah, I'm not used to,
I know, it's
I'm
been
not used
years.
to having to read.
Number 10, appointment of suspension hearing officer. Recommend a motion to appoint Fred Bolden as the hearing officer to represent the Board of Education for any appeal of suspensions. Can I have a motion, please?
So moved.
Second.
Moved by Mr. Patton, seconded by Mrs. Barksdale.
Mrs. Moses, this is a process that we use, whereas in lieu of the board sitting in on suspension appeal hearings, you appoint me instead of the board to do it, and then I work for the board's capacity to do that. Their next appeal would be to the Court of Common Pleas above that.
Thank you. Mr. Buchanan?
Mr. Patton.
Yes.
Mrs. Barksdale.
Yes.
Mr. Heckman.
Yes.
Mrs. Glavin.
Yes.
Mrs. Moses.
Yes. Number 11, appointment of expulsion hearing officer. Recommended motion to approve Cuyahoga County Board of Education as hearing officer to act as the designee of the Board of Education for hearing expulsions referred to them by the Board of Education for 2023. May I have a motion, please?
So moved.
Second?
Moved by Mr. Heckman, seconded by Mrs. Glavin.
Yes, after an expulsion hearing, if we choose to uphold the expulsion process, the next step would be to the Cuyahoga County Board of Education. So after us, as our body going through it, if they wish to appeal it further, it would be to the Cuyahoga County Board of Education.
Okay. Any questions? Mr. Buchanan?
Mr. Heckman.
Yes.
Mrs. Glavin.
Yes.
Mrs. Barksdale.
Yes.
Mr. Patton.
Yes.
Mrs. Moses.
Yes. Number 12, signature authorization. Recommended motion to approve a resolution authorizing the superintendent to sign contracts on any agreement with the Education Service Center. Can I have a motion, please?
So moved?
Second.
Moved by Mrs. Glavin, seconded by Mr. Patton.
Yes, this process is, this is the process so that if, for anything that we do with the ESC of Northeast Ohio or the ESC of Summit County, any of those things, any of those contracts we enter into, I am able to sign in the board's stead for those.
Thank you. Mr. Buchanan?
Mrs. Glavin.
Yes.
Mr. Heckman.
Yes.
Mrs. Barksdale.
Yes.
Mr. Patton.
Yes.
Mrs. Moses.
Yes. Number 13, membership in OSBA. Recommended motion to renew the Solon Board of Education's membership in the Ohio School Boards Association for 2023.
So moved.
Second.
Moved by Mrs. Barksdale, seconded by Mr. Heckman.
Yes, the Ohio School Boards Association is the organization for all school boards in Ohio. That they're an advocacy group. They take our feedback and information. They use that to go down to the State House to basically lobby for school boards in general for issues that are important to us.
I think you need stuff like this.
And you get certificates of appreciation during School Board Recognition Month. Absolutely.
I was honored.
There you go.
All right, Mr. Buchanan.
Mrs. Barksdale.
Yes.
Mr. Heckman.
Yes.
Mrs. Glavin.
Yes.
Mr. Patton.
Yes.
Mrs. Moses.
Yes. Number 14, membership in Ohio Educational Policy Institute. Recommended motion to approve the Solon Board of Education's membership in the Ohio Education Policy Institute for calendar year 2023 for the amount of $1,500. For many years, Solon schools have been a part of the Ohio Educational Policy Institute. This is a nonprofit research arm of all the educational organizations that provide unbiased research regarding school funding. Can I have a motion, please?
So moved.
Second.
Moved by Mr. Heckman, seconded by Mr. Patton.
Yes, OEPI does a lot of research for the state of Ohio, and they provide information that's used by many of the other organizations to help us when we're looking at fair school funding and many other issues that are of import in terms of larger policy as it impacts all of Ohio schools.
Thank you. Mr. Buchanan?
Mr. Heckman.
Yes.
Mr. Patton.
Yes.
Mrs. Barksdale.
Yes.
Mrs. Glavin.
Yes.
Mrs. Moses.
Yes. Number 15, OSBA Legal Assistance Fund. Recommended motion to approve the Solon Board of Education participating in the OSBA Legal Assistance Fund for the 2023 calendar year. Can I have a motion, please?
So moved?
Second.
Moved by Mrs. Glavin, seconded by Mrs. Barksdale.
The Legal Assistance Fund from the Ohio School Boards Association, it's a trust fund essentially that is established to provide assistance to boards of education for cases of significant controversy or statewide significance, primarily at the state level.
Thank you. Mr. Buchanan?
Mrs. Glavin.
Yes.
Mrs. Barksdale.
Yes.
Mr. Heckman.
Yes.
Mr. Patton.
Yes.
Mrs. Moses.
Yes. Number 16, the Records Commission meeting.
Yep, this is our meeting. Actually, we keep this as a placeholder in the event that at this time during the year, we have any type of records that need to be disposed of or submitted to the state before we can dispose of them. But there's nothing today, and we'll take a look at this again as we come closer to the end of this actual school year.
Okay, thank you. Number 17, IDEA Part B, ARP IDEA Part B, and ARP Early Childhood Education Public Hearing. Under Ohio law, boards of education are now required to hold a public hearing regarding the use of IDEA Part B, ARP IDEA Part B, and ARP Early Childhood Special Education Public Hearing funds. This hearing satisfies that obligation.
Yes, in the event, this is exactly what it says, in the event that there were any questions regarding the funding, we make people aware of the fact that we do receive these funds and that they're welcome to come to the office at any point in time, meet with myself, meet with our Director of Pupil Services, and discuss how those funds, how those grants are, how they're spent and what they're spent on.
Thank you.
Yep, and we do that.
Okay, at this time, I'd like a motion for an adjournment for the organizational meeting. As noted, the regular meeting will immediately follow the adjournment of the organizational meeting. Can I
So
have a-
moved?
Second?
Moved by Mrs. Glavin, second by Mr. Heckman.
Mrs. Glavin,
Yes.
Mr. Heckman,
Yes.
Mrs. Barksdale?
Yes.
Mr. Patton?
Yes.
Mrs. Moses?
Yes.